The estate sale. I've always had a thing for vintage furniture, so when I saw an ad on Craigslist for an estate sale in a nearby town, I couldn't resist. The listing promised rare and antique pieces at ridiculously low prices, and I figured it was worth checking out. The address wasn't too far from where I lived, just a quick drive out of the city into a quieter, older part of town. The house itself looked like it hadn't been touched in years. A grand, two-story Victorian with peeling paint and overgrown ivy creeping up the sides. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of life except for an old, rusty car parked in the driveway. For a moment, I hesitated. Something about the place gave me a weird feeling, but I shrugged it off. People who owned old houses like this were probably either eccentric or too old to keep it maintained. I knocked on the front door, and it creaked open almost immediately. An elderly woman stood in the doorway wearing a faded floral dress and smiling in a way that was both welcoming and unsettling at the same time. "You're here for the sale?" she asked in a soft, raspy voice. I nodded, feeling a little awkward. "Yeah, I saw the ad on Craigslist." She stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. "Take whatever you like. Everything must go." The house was mostly empty, but scattered throughout the rooms were various old pieces of furniture, a vintage armoire in the hallway, a grand mirror leaning against the living room wall, a set of worn leather chairs near the fireplace. It felt eerie, like the house had been frozen in time. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and something else I couldn't quite place. Something metallic, almost like rust. As I wandered through the house, the old woman followed me at a distance, her eyes never leaving me. It was strange, but I was too focused on the furniture to pay her much attention. I ended up finding a couple of great pieces, a small wooden writing desk and an intricately carved chair that I just knew would fit perfectly in my apartment. "How much for these?" I asked, motioning to the desk and chair. The old woman gave me that same unsettling smile. "Take them, no charge." I blinked. "Really? You don't want anything for them?" She shook her head. "Just take them. They belong with you now." I should have left then. Every instinct in my body told me something was off, but the thrill of getting these vintage pieces for free clouded my judgment. I thanked her, loaded the desk and chair into my car, and drove home, feeling like I'd just scored the deal of a lifetime. That night, after setting up the furniture in my apartment, things started to feel wrong. At first, it was subtle, just a strange, cold draft that I couldn't place, and the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to my imagination and went to bed. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of creaking wood. It was faint at first, like someone was walking slowly across the floor, but it was coming from my living room. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just the old floorboards settling under the weight of the new furniture. The next morning, I found the chair moved. Just slightly, but enough to make me pause. I hadn't touched it since the night before. A chill ran down my spine, but again, I brushed it off. Maybe I bumped it when I was moving around the room. Over the next few days, things escalated. The temperature in my apartment dropped, no matter how high I turned up the heat. I'd hear whispers, faint but unmistakable, whenever I walked past the desk or the chair. Once, I swear I saw a reflection in the mirror on the desk, an old woman standing behind me, but when I turned around, no one was there. The final straw came one evening when I got home from work. The chair had moved again, this time halfway across the room, and on the desk, scratched into the wood, were two words: "Help me." Terrified, I grabbed my phone and tried to call the number from the Craigslist ad, but when I looked for it, the listing was gone. There was no record of it. The address, the ad, the phone number, it had all vanished, like it never existed. I even drove back to the house, desperate for some kind of explanation, but when I arrived, it was boarded up. The lawn was completely overgrown, the house looked like it hadn't been touched in years, and there was no sign of the old woman. It was like no one had lived there for decades. I left the desk and chair outside that night. By morning, they were gone. I haven't looked at Craigslist since. The house-sitting job. I was browsing Craigslist one afternoon looking for some quick cash gigs when I stumbled across a house-sitting ad. The job seemed easy enough. Just watch over a house for the weekend while the owner was away. The pay was good, almost too good, and the house looked stunning in the photos. A modern, remote getaway nestled in the woods, completely isolated from the bustle of the city. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to get paid for doing practically nothing. I reached out immediately, and within a couple of hours I got a response. The owner seemed friendly, though a bit formal, and gave me the details. She was heading out of town for a business trip and needed someone to watch her house, mostly to deter any potential break-ins. She mentioned the house had a state-of-the-art security system and gave me a detailed list of instructions. The only thing that struck me as odd was a couple of peculiar rules. Don't answer the door after midnight. Ignore any phone calls from my number. I laughed a little at the second rule, thinking maybe it was just a prank or an error in the message. But she repeated it when we spoke on the phone later. If you see my number on your phone, don't pick up. I won't be calling you. I should have asked more questions, but I didn't. I figured maybe it was a typo or just some strange personal quirk. Besides, I'd already agreed to the job and didn't want to seem overly paranoid. The house was exactly as advertised, modern, sleek, and isolated in a way that was both peaceful and unsettling. There were no neighbors for miles, just dense woods surrounding the property. The first night was quiet. I settled in, cooked some dinner, and spent most of the evening lounging on the sofa, enjoying the view of the vast forest through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Around 11:30 p.m., I started getting ready for bed when I heard a soft knock on the front door. I froze, remembering the first rule. Don't answer the door after midnight. But it wasn't midnight yet, just half an hour shy. I went to the window, careful not to be seen, and peeked out. No one was there. I chalked it up to my imagination or maybe just the house settling, but the sound came again, this time a bit louder. Knock, knock, knock. I moved toward the front door, hesitating with my hand on the knob, but something in me couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I called out, "Hello?" "Who's there?" Silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for a response, but nothing came. Finally, I walked back to the living room, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. That's when my phone rang. I glanced down and felt my stomach drop. The caller ID showed the owner's number. I remembered her rule: ignore any phone calls from my number. I stared at the screen, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to pick up and demand an explanation, but a deeper, primal instinct told me not to. I let the phone ring out. Then it rang again, the same number flashing on the screen. After the third call, I turned my phone on silent and tossed it onto the couch, trying to ignore the gnawing anxiety building inside me. I checked the time. 12:15 a.m. That's when the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't soft. Bang, bang, bang. I rushed to the door, my heart pounding. I still couldn't see anyone through the window. But the knocking didn't stop. It was relentless, loud, echoing through the empty house. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The house was dead silent. I stood there holding my breath, unsure if I should stay or leave. My phone vibrated again on the couch, the screen lighting up with the owner's number. Unable to take it anymore, I grabbed my phone and texted the owner. "Are you calling me? Someone is knocking on the door." No response. Another minute passed. My phone vibrated again, this time with a message. "Don't answer." That's when the lights in the house flickered, and I heard footsteps upstairs. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was walking slowly down the hall. My blood ran cold. I was supposed to be the only person here. I grabbed my car keys, not caring about the job anymore. I bolted for the door, ignoring whatever was happening upstairs. As I got into my car and sped down the long driveway, my phone buzzed one last time. Another text from the owner. "I told you not to answer." I didn't stop driving until I reached the city limits, leaving the house far behind. I never looked back, never contacted the owner again, and I sure as hell never took another Craigslist gig. Whatever was in that house, whatever those rules were meant to protect me from, I wasn't sticking around to find out. The missing car buyer. I had been trying to sell my car for a while, and after listing it on Craigslist, I finally got a decent offer from a buyer. He seemed a little too eager, replying almost instantly after I posted the ad. At first, I was relieved to have someone interested, especially since it had been sitting for weeks with no serious bites. We agreed to meet in a public parking lot, standard practice, just to keep things safe. But about an hour before our meeting, the buyer messaged me asking if we could switch the location to my house instead. He gave some excuse about being stuck at work and needing to make the deal quickly. At first, I hesitated. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Meeting strangers from Craigslist at your house is usually a no-go. But I needed the sale, and his offer was solid. So against my better judgment, I agreed. When he finally arrived, it was already late, maybe around 9 p.m., and the sun had set. His car, a dark, beat-up sedan, pulled up slowly to the curb in front of my house. The headlights stayed on for a few seconds after he parked, illuminating the street in an eerie glow. I watched him from my living room window, and something about the way he moved set off alarm bells. He stepped out of his car, tall and lanky, and stood there for a moment, staring at my house before heading to my car in the driveway. I walked outside to greet him, trying to shake off the unease. "Hey, you made it. Want to take a look at the car?" He didn't respond immediately, just nodded and started walking around my car in slow, deliberate steps, inspecting it in silence. I tried to make small talk, but he wasn't interested. His face was blank, almost expressionless, as if he wasn't really there at all. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "I'll take it," he said, barely looking at me. "Great," I replied, feeling a little relieved. "Do you want to take it for a test drive first? Make sure everything's good?" "No need," he muttered, still avoiding eye contact. "I trust you." That felt odd. Who buys a car without even driving it? But at that point, I just wanted the sale to go through. He handed me an envelope with cash, all neatly counted out, and I handed over the keys and the title. The whole interaction lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt much longer. He got back into his own car, and I watched as he sat there for a few minutes, engine running, just staring through the windshield. Then, without a word, he drove off, leaving my car parked where it was. I went back inside, uneasy but glad to have the deal done. I figured he'd come back in the morning to pick up the car. But when I woke up the next day, something strange caught my eye. His car, the beat-up sedan he'd driven the night before, was still parked out front. My own car was untouched, still sitting in the driveway just as I had left it. But there was no sign of him. I figured maybe he had walked somewhere or had someone pick him up. But as the day wore on, his car remained parked outside, and I never saw him return. By that evening, my unease had grown into full-blown paranoia. What kind of person leaves their car behind after making a purchase like that? I tried calling the number he'd used to contact me, but it went straight to voicemail. I sent a few texts, asking if everything was okay, but got no reply. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to the thought of his car sitting there right outside my house like some silent watcher. I kept imagining him standing outside, staring up at my windows in the dark. By the next morning, the car was still there, untouched. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police and explained the situation, worried that something might have happened to the guy. Maybe he had gotten lost or had some kind of emergency. When the officers arrived, they inspected the car. It was unlocked, and when they opened the door, they found nothing inside. No personal belongings, no papers. Nothing to indicate who the car belonged to. It was almost as if it had been abandoned. The weirdest part, the car wasn't registered to anyone. The VIN number didn't match any records, and there was no way to trace it back to the buyer. The police told me they'd keep investigating, but after a while, it seemed like they just chalked it up as some kind of odd Craigslist scam. Weeks passed, and the car remained in front of my house. No one came to claim it. Every time I left the house, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, even though I knew the buyer was long gone, if he had ever really been there at all. I never heard from him again, and eventually, the police had the car towed. But the whole thing still haunts me. I can't shake the feeling that something was off, that the buyer wasn't just some eager Craigslist customer. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself looking out the window, expecting to see that dark sedan parked outside again. And every time I wonder, did I really sell my car that night? Or did I give something else away?